We are here to learn, continue to pursue all things that we want to learn before we all kick the bucket. So good morning and glad to have you guys here. My name is Sarah Smith. I work at Grinnell College, and I have the pleasure of working with the CEC Council to bring this to you every week. And in a couple weeks, we're going to start to plan the spring 2024, so that'll be exciting as well. So if you have any ideas, we'd love to hear from you about some ideas for the spring, but excited to have you here today. So a couple things, please make sure you silence your phone. If you have a T-coil, please turn it on. If time allows, which there'll be plenty of time for questions, we'll come around with the microphone so everyone can hear questions. And then after the program, gentle reminder, if you could stay and help us put all the chairs back, that would be lovely, so we can all get on with our day. So, and now for our main event today here. So a little blurb that Chris gave to me. The rare book collection held at Grinnell College Libraries has been over 150 years in the making and has been built through both strategic purchases and generous donations. In this lecture, Chris Jones, Associate Professor and Special Collections Librarian and Archivist of the college, you will learn about three fascinating men who originally collected the books that would become the core of the rare book collection. Their treasures include the copy of Shakespeare's Second Folio, is that right? Printed books dating back to 1470s, and a manuscript books dating back to the 14th century. So, without further delay, will you please help me in welcoming Chris Jones.
Well, this will be an exciting talk. Okay, hi, my name is Chris Jones. I am the Special Collections Librarian and Archivist of the College at Grinnell. And before we start talking about the three gentlemen who are responsible for building what we think of as the core of the rare book collection at Grinnell, I kind of want to just address probably one of the biggest question actually that we get in special collections, and that is, what's so special about special collections? So, special collections is made up of broadly speaking, three categories. It's the home of the college archives, and it's a living collection, which means that we continually add to it. So we have material dating from like the 1840s, early 1840s, related to the foundation of the college, but before it actually arrived in Davenport, up through earlier this year. So we add to it almost daily. It's made up of a huge variety of material, including files from administrative offices, materials documenting student groups, biographical files on prominent alumni, staff, and faculty, materials documenting the history of the curriculum, and some local history, enough local history to kind of give context to the college within the community. Some highlights of the college archives include recordings and transcripts of the 1967 convocation on campus. That was when Martin Luther King Jr. was here to speak. So we have a recording of his talk, Remaining Awake Through the Revolution. And that's kind of an interesting talk because, I mean, it's interesting for a lot of reasons, but it's fascinating because he kind of situates himself chronologically, if we zoom out a little bit, because he apologizes for being late, but then he also apologizes for having to leave early. The reason being that the evening of the day that he spoke here at Grinnell, he had to meet with his lawyers in Georgia, and the following day, he had to show up for his famous jail stint in Birmingham. So it's kind of interesting to see how those events of the last 6 or 8 months of his life play out like that. We also have an enormous scrapbook collection dating from the 1880s up through the early 20-teens. And those, what's unique about those, one of the things that is unique about those scrapbooks is that they're an interesting peek into student life that is unfiltered in a way that You know, a lot of publications on campus are created by an administrative office, and they give a certain perspective. But the scrapbooks are created by the students, typically for themselves or for maybe a close-knit group of people. But it's basically by students for students, and so you get a perspective that might not be otherwise conveyed, right? So there are some interesting insights into residence hall living. There are some interesting insights. I'm thinking about, back when Arbor Lake had a boathouse, for example, and students trekking down to Arbor Lake for the day and having picnics and just sort of having a day at the lake. So those scrapbooks are really fascinating. Dance cards, does anybody remember using dance cards? So many dance cards, and the students now are just smitten with these things. Like those, it's just a piece of history that they have. There's no real, I was thinking about this with somebody else earlier this semester already, and there's no real analog. There's no app for that, curiously. Unless it'd be like writing on your hand or something, like, I'm going to dance with Micah next or something, right? But there's no analog for dance cards. So these things, this curious phenomenon that really doesn't move forward through time is just, it's a magnet for the students. They just love that stuff. Anyway, we have founding documents of the college drafted in Davenport before it was moved to Grinnell, which are really interesting. We have thousands and thousands of photographs. Many of them come to us from our own communications department, but many of them are donated by community members or alumni. And so we have thousands of photographs that document the college through time, which is absolutely amazing. Recording things like athletic events, talks on campus, just panoramic views of sort of the center of campus back when it was very park-like in the maybe 1890 to 1920, where there are enormous trees growing up in the middle of campus, and it looks just gorgeous. And we also have information about a lot of the buildings on campus, and extensive historic information on a lot of the older buildings. So if you ever pass in campus and you think, I wonder what the story about Grinnell Hall is, we've actually got a file for that. A lot of those files were actually created by Wally Walker. Some of you may have known the Walkers. Waldo, when he was on senior faculty status, basically faced retirement for faculty. He put his project was to put together histories of a lot of the oldest buildings on campus and some of the ones that don't even exist anymore. And so there's some terrific information there that he pulled together about Goodnow Hall and the Forum and Burling, Blair Hall even, that was taken down so long ago, right? So it's a terrific cache of information. So that's the college archives. The second major collection that we have is a manuscript collection, and that's kind of manuscript writ large, okay? In a lot of special libraries like ours, manuscript is sort of synonymous with miscellaneous. And I'm really glad that my predecessors went with manuscript, because I hate the word miscellaneous. You can always describe something better than just saying, bunch of stuff. It's useless, right? I mean, you don't know what's in that group of stuff, and nobody's ever going to search for the phrase bunch of stuff. So there it sits until you describe it better. And I always tell my students, like, if you're going to use the word miscellaneous, I'm going to ask you to redo the finding aid. Like, go back and describe what that means, actually, so that people can find this material, because this is valuable, this is cool, this should be shared. We need people to be able to find it. But manuscript is kind of, in special library lingo, miscellaneous, which kind of kills me, but there it is. The manuscript collection also contains a huge variety of material. James Norman Hall, who was a class of 1910, co-wrote Mutiny on the Bounty, maybe a familiar name to some of you as an author. He was born and raised in Colfax down the road, fought in World War I as a member of several countries' air squadrons, most famously the Lafayette Escadrille. Like I said, co-wrote Mutiny on the Bounty, and just a ton of similar adventure stories. when he was done with the war, when the war was over, he decided that he'd had enough, and he moved to Tahiti. Met a woman there, raised a family, spent some time back in the U.S. Sent he wanted his students to have an education in the U.S., so sent his kids to California for school, but lived most of the rest of his life in Tahiti. And we thought for years that that was kind of a closed collection also, that there would be no more material. He's not been with us for some time now. He's not writing, right? But then a couple of his great-granddaughters contacted me several years ago, and they've been sending more Hall family materials. So we are actually building on the Hall paper collection, which is really exciting. Another example of material from manuscript collection, correspondence of Jimmy Lay, who was class of 1944. He spent 1 year here at the college, and then he enlisted in the U.S. Army, and flew in a photography plane in World War II. And a photography plane, for those who aren't familiar with the idea, before radar, on any given bombing run, there would be 2 planes sent out. The first was a photography plane, and they would take photos of the intended target. The second plane was the bomber, and then as the bomber was doing its job, the photography plane would fly in a giant circle and then follow the bomber around and take photos sort of the intended target afterward. So he was in a photography plane, and during his very last mission, his plane was shot down, and he was MIA for a year and a half or 2. And then eventually his body was identified in a cemetery in France, and his remains were flown home back to Lakota, Iowa, in north central Iowa. So he was another local boy. Fleming Fraker postcard collection. This is one of 3 postcard collections. It's one of the largest. We have approximately 7,000 postcards in this collection that represent 501 different Iowa towns around the state. And they range from about 1900 up through the 1960s, but most of them are dated right around 1910 or so. So that's kind of a neat collection to see. The PhD thesis of Sen Katayama, who was a founding member of the Japanese Communist Party. He was a Grinnell class alum of 1892, actually. And he kept in touch with his professor, L.F. Parker, who some of you may have heard of. So we have his thesis that he sent to Parker, which wound up in our collection. And then when Katayama passed away in 1933, he was entombed in the Kremlin. So there really are Grinnellians everywhere. Medieval documents donated by Bill Ingram, class of 1953, include things like land deeds, a Scrivener's ledger page, and an illuminated manuscript leaf. So all things from the medieval period, which are kind of neat insights into business documents. And last example, records of the Grinnell UCC Congregational Church. The records date from approximately 1850 up through about 2009 and include materials like the church records, meeting notes, annual reports, and the publication Our Church Greeting. So if you're ever doing local history, this is a wonderful cache. It's also good for genealogy. A lot of people have found some family members going through the UCC records. So that's sort of an example of the breadth and depth of the manuscript collection. And the rare book collection, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Should have scrolled ahead. So here's, this is Jimmy Lay here on the left. The Old Stone Church, example from a postcard, and then on the far right is an example of the manuscript leaf from Bill Ingram's donation. So these are examples of the manuscript collection. And then the rare book collection. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But generally, there are approximately 14,000 volumes, so it is a huge collection in total, especially for an institution our size. The oldest item is also the oldest example of writing in the collection. And it's a cuneiform tablet that is about an inch and a half square. and dates from approximately 2000 BCE, so by far the oldest thing in our collection. The oldest manuscript codex, and a codex is basically just a bound book, so anytime you think of just a book, that's an example of a codex, as opposed to, for example, a scroll. But the oldest manuscript codex, or book, dates from the 14th century, and it's a book of hours. And the oldest machine-printed book, the oldest book printed on letterpress, is from 1475, and it's 4 works by Thomas Aquinas. And I think I included a picture of the title page later. So those are some of the highlights of the rare book collection. The space is climate controlled, so if you've never been down there, take your jacket. The thermometer is set at 65, which typically means by the time the air gets to us, it's about 67 degrees, so it's on the cool side. Similarly, we try to keep the relative humidity around 40%, so it's cool and dry. We support classes from all across the curriculum, including all 3 divisions: the sciences, the science division, the humanities division, and the social studies division. Although we primarily see classes from social studies and humanities, although we're always trying to get more science people in. Here we are in, I think maybe the 6th week of class already. And so far we've worked with class visits from theater and dance, English, history, art history, several different tutorial topics, and music. So we are working with a broad variety of people from across the curriculum. And we managed to get this all done with 2 permanent full-time staff people, myself and my staff colleague Allison Hake, and 1 full-time term person who we're actually losing at the end of fall break here, Laura Michelson. So I've been here in Special Collections since 2010, first actually as the staff person in Allison's line, and then in 2010 I applied for and became the Special Collections Librarian. So that's to give you a sense of how long we've all been there. So the first person we're going to talk about a little bit is George Pinney. George was, by all accounts, an only child. There just aren't a whole lot of records of his family. But he was apparently an only child and had, at the time of his passing, no remaining family members. So documentation of his life in general is fairly scant. He was born approximately 1918 and passed away in December of 1969. What we do know is largely gleaned from some correspondence that he has left. Some is at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Some has found its way to various public libraries. We have some material or some correspondence when he began writing to the president of Grinnell about the possibility of donating his collection. But there isn't a whole lot of primary resource information about George. So there are large sort of, I don't want to say shadows over his life, but there are a lot of sort of dark spots that we haven't been able to penetrate yet. He was a dermatologist in Omaha. He graduated from the University of Nebraska Medical School in June of 1941, or rather after graduating in June of 1941, he joined the Medical Corps of the U.S. Army as a lieutenant, and in 1946 he left the Army at the rank of captain and returned to Omaha. At that point, both of his parents were still living, and that's where most of his family was kind of located. He graduated from the University of Nebraska Medical School, like I said. He returned to the University of Nebraska Medical Center as a professor for several years. Although a professor of what, it's not wholly clear, which is kind of interesting because when he left, in what kind of sounds like a snit, honestly, he said, well, it's all up to the next guy, but tell him that he's got some rounds that begin at 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday, and he's meeting with these 3 people on Monday afternoon and Tuesday. And that was it. He was out. So I'm not really sure what happened there, but it didn't sound great. after leaving the medical center, though, he focused on his private practice, which apparently was extraordinarily successful around Omaha. And we think that's what actually kept him able to support his collecting habit. George seems to have been shaken by the passing of his father, because at that point he expresses to a friend that he had concerns about the proximity of his collection to Offutt Air Force Base. There's no particular reason you should know this, but it's important to know because Offutt was part of the missile defense system at the time, and I imagine probably still is. And Penny's concern was that should the Russians ever begin to bomb America, they would probably target the missile defense systems first. And with his book collection so close to the Air Force Base, he didn't want anything to happen to his books. And so he was looking for a place that they could go, they could go where they wouldn't go boom, right? So, I mean, makes sense. And he actually had a friend who was a Grinnell alum. And it was this alum who reached out to the president and said, I've got this friend, he's got some books, what do you think? And I mean, this is kind of at the height of the Cold War. This is right after the Cuba Missile Crisis. So it's on everybody's mind, but he's got sort of a vested interest in making sure that his property remained okay. The president at the time reached out to the librarian of the college at that point, Henry Alden, and introduced him to Penny. And Penny was very serious about his collecting, and as the collection grew, he actually began to catalog his own books. And we have 2 large volumes of bound onion skin, so super thin paper, and the volumes together are still about this thick, right? So he took great care in making sure that his collection was very well cataloged. In some cases, there are like Xeroxed copies of title pages and notes indicating what make this volume unique, like lots of notes written in the margins or leaves missing or something, but whatever made that specific volume unique in the world, he noted all of that material. At the time of the discussions with Alden, George described his collection as being approximately 3,000 volumes, containing 3 incunabula. Incunabula are books printed between 1450 and 1500. The word is Latin, and it means from the cradle, so it's from the cradle or from the birth of printing. So 3 incunabula, books on European culture, first editions of Fielding, Gibbon, and Ben Franklin, a lot of Victorian age English and American literature, and a large historical autograph collection. So there was a lot of material. Some of those, some specific examples of those include first editions of The Origin of Species by Darwin, 2 fragments of Shakespeare's first folio. And so when I say fragment, what I mean is it used to be fairly common, odious but common, for book dealers to tear old books apart and sell the books off chapter by chapter, because one could make more money as a bookseller by selling off those small parts than they would be able to make if they sold the entire volume as one object. Extraordinarily unethical. I don't think we need to point that out, but there it is. And there's a strong pushback now against people doing that. So like librarians, book collectors, like really try hard not to buy from vendors who are known to have done that in the past. So it's a known thing. What else? First editions of Mark Twain and Charles Dickens, several of Dickens' works in their original parts. So by original part, I mean basically there was a printing practice that included publishers selling books by chapter, basically. and that served several purposes. First, the revenue of like one chapter would go to printing and publishing the next chapter, so there was a revenue aspect. It also served as kind of a publicity op because kind of like serialized television programs now, you know, there was sort of that excitement of what happens next, what's going on, and it also served as an opportunity for the author to inject some kind of suspense or cliffhangers. So really, like the modern cliffhangers, we think of it, a lot of that can be traced back to this practice of selling chapter by chapter rather than whole volumes at a time. There were also first editions of Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, first edition of John Locke's Essays on Human Understanding, first edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, as well as Melville's Moby Dick, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, first edition of Henry David Thoreau's Walden, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and Dickens' David Copperfield. So like it is an amazing collection. And there were some other sort of just books that he had that were special to him that when they arrived here at the college, we just didn't have space for in the area where those rare books had been kept at the time. And so if you go up through the circulating collection in Burling, every once in a while, if you pull an old-looking book off a shelf, there's a chance that there will be a George Pinney bookplate in it because some of that material had to be stored in the circulating collection. So yeah, an extraordinary collection of material. Peter Jordan is our scholar, and he was a lifelong scholar. I got to know Peter actually, of the three of these collectors I'll talk about. I actually got to know Peter in the last like 6 or 8 years of his life, and he was the quietest, softest spoken, probably one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. Here he is with his wife Margot, and a couple of examples of title pages from books that he's donated. Peter was extraordinarily private, and so getting to know him was kind of difficult at first. There's very little documentation left behind after his passing. I happen to know him, so I could glean a little bit here and there, and then after he passed, I continued corresponding with his wife Margot for a couple of years. And Peter was born on January 21st, 1942 in Short Hills, New Jersey, and met Margot through the dating organization Single Book Lovers. So I'll read an excerpt from his obituary, which was clearly written by Margot, who was a very successful. She was a tenured English professor at UW-Madison, I believe, in the UW system. I believe it was Madison, and has, I want to say, maybe 4 or 5 books, scholarly publications under her own belt. So she was a very good writer. And in his obit, she writes, as apparently the only member who had read more than the swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated, he appealed to Margot, and they were married in 1981. So I'm glad things worked out. Peter made his living through private investing. He was independently wealthy, and in addition to already being wealthy, he grew that wealth, and there are a very limited number of things that he pumped that money back into. His family, his own book collection, and his community. He had apparently purchased, and he never, in 8 years, never shared this with me, but apparently he had owned, I think it was 11 acres of lake area in the town that he and Margot lived in, and he had let it go to seed. Like it was a beautiful wooded area, and upon his passing, he had bequeathed that space to the town that he lived in. So like he was very community centered and very family centered. He and Margot did everything together. So he bounced around from Ivy League to Ivy League and some other institutions. He was at MIT apparently for a little while, but he didn't feel like he was properly engaged or interested in his studies there. Basically, he was bored, and so he left. He left MIT. And that was it. That was kind of it. He was self-educated, where George Pinney purchased his collection because many of those books are beautiful. They're very attractive. They're very striking in one way or another. Peter purchased his books to study, and he knew several languages, seemed to be able to read Latin very well, was able to read a number of Germanic languages. And so where George collected his stuff and kept it on a shelf and kept it very pretty, Peter, he used it. Like, he used those books. And so when we received them, we started finding bookmarks all over the place, and they were whatever was close to hand. So his doctor's prescriptions were stuck in there. Margot's doctor prescriptions were stuck in places, frequently with notes scribbled on the back. Dot matrix printers, right? Everybody remembers a good dot matrix printer, and the sprocket holes that you tore off along the sides, everywhere in this collection as bookmarks. It was really wild. It was just, I mean, he was clearly just sitting there, and whatever was close to hand, he would just grab it and mark his spot and walk away. It was wild. So in 2009, he decided he wanted to find a home for his collection. His health, he felt, was starting to take some turns, and he was concerned that larger schools, like state schools or research institutions, would not only have copies of these things, but that they would be prettier in some way. And he never identified what pretty meant, but in light of George Pinney's collection, I kind of have a sense of what he meant. And so he started making lists of smaller institutions who may not have the budget or otherwise access to these kinds of materials, and organized that list by reputation. And Grinnell College was the first institution on that list, which is pretty exciting. He began a discussion with the college in 2009, and in 2010, he bequeathed over 400 volumes to the libraries. And as a show of good faith, he just outright donated 25 volumes at the time that he signed those papers. And those 25 volumes dated between 1505 and 1695. So just to give you a sense of, like, he was just able to whip out 25 books and be like, here, these are all 200 and 300 years old, and they should be here. He wound up, actually, my immediate predecessor, Catherine Rodd, stayed in touch with him. He did not have email. He did not use a computer. So she stayed in touch with him via mail. And every time we pulled a book for a class or a student found something particularly engaging, she would write to him and she would share that with him so that he could sort of live vicariously. And he loved that. And as a result, he actually every year or two, he would send us another somewhere between maybe 50 and 200 volumes. I think the biggest shipment was like 200 volumes. So yeah, he was really pleased with the attention that these books that he was giving were getting. Most of the collection falls between 1480 and the early 1600s, but some of the volumes date as recently as the mid-1900s. Those tend to be reference books or personal books that weren't actually part of his rare book collection, but that he used for reference for other things. And the subjects are very wide-ranging, with a large focus on Western, particularly New World and Western European history, but also include philosophy, literature, and some natural science. He remained a scholar his whole life, and even up to a couple of months before his passing, he actually called me a couple of times and said, "Is everything's set? Everything's good? I have this fond memory," and then he could just sort of recite parts of these books just off the top of his head while he was on the phone with me. And what else should you know about Peter? I think that probably covers it. Yeah, just the scraps of paper everywhere, just everywhere. And some of them, honestly, some of them were those dot matrix sprocket hole things, and we would just be like, oh my gosh, what was this, and throw it away. But some of those notes were really important. For example, it's because of one of those notes that he left for himself, presumably, but that we found after he passed, that we know we have I think what is believed to be the first biographical information of William Shakespeare in any known volume. So that's kind of exciting to see how scholars post-Shakespeare were talking about Shakespeare. I think it was as recently as like 40 years after Shakespeare's passing. So, I mean, sort of his contemporaries and how people were talking about Shakespeare in his own time. So, very cool, wonderful, wonderful person. Margot was amazing too, very welcoming. That's Peter Jordan. Carl Weeks is the third person we'll talk about, and he was the inventor. Here's Carl with his family and some examples of the material. Oh yeah, the far right over there, that's the example of the 1475 book that I told you is the oldest printed book in our collection now. The color that you see there in the decoration, that's all hand done, but all of the black letters, that was all letterpress. And the volume is about this thick, and it's probably, if it stood on end, it's probably 16 or 18 inches tall. It's enormous. And some people went all the way through and decorated every single page in some way. Not all as ornately as what you see over there on the far right. In some cases, it's just making little red marks to indicate where new sentences or new paragraphs would begin. But all the way through this enormous book, scribes went through and decorated it in some way. So Carl and Edith, his wife, were both native Iowans. Edith was born in Dubuque on August 2nd, 1882, and Carl was born in rural Lynn County on December 2nd, 1876. Carl was born into a family that contains several pharmacists, including two of his brothers. He graduated in 1892 from Highland Park College in Des Moines, having studied pharmacy. In 1902, Carl and his brother Leo joined with a third brother, Diet, in the new family drug company, and they worked together until 1908 when Diet passed away. At that point, Carl and Leo formed a new company and worked together for just a handful of years, and then beginning in 1915, Carl struck out on his own and formed the Armand Company. And Carl's biggest claim to fame, and probably what earned him his fortune later, was that he invented cosmetic foundation. He combined cold cream and face powder into a new product, and now we have foundation, which is kind of foundation, like sliced bread invented in Iowa. So with the popularity of the company, and especially the new cosmetic, came new wealth, and the Weekses decided to build a home that was inspired by the King's House, which they encountered during a visit to England in 1921, in Salisbury, England. And some of you may be familiar with Salisbury House in Des Moines. That's the home that they built, based on the King's House. It's gorgeous. Yeah, if you ever have an opportunity, definitely hit Salisbury House. The Weekses family grew and eventually welcomed 4 boys into the family, as you can see there. Edith passed away in 1955, and Carl passed in 1962. Both Carl and Edith were very supportive of education, and at one time they had bequeathed their entire estate to Drake University. But for a variety of reasons, Drake actually had to wind up giving it back. So Carl even served on the board of trustees at Drake for a number of years. So, like, they're both the Weekses were very, very interested in promoting education. The books in the collection all date from 1575, and the earliest from 1575. Well, 1475. That's a total typo. So 1475. That's the far one down there, up through the 1960s. But the majority of the collection falls somewhere between like 1650 and 1960. And it dovetails nicely. What's nice about all three of these collections is there's some overlap chronologically, but even then, the topics, the subjects covered, there's a nice spread. So we have an amazing collection basically from 1475 up through the 1960s or so, and we've got so many other volumes that don't fall within these three collections, but the core collection is just so amazing in that they dovetail nicely. There's not a ton of overlap, and they all speak to each other really well. So there are 12 incunabula in this collection, again, 1450 to 1500. 3 manuscript book of hours. There's a strength of arts and crafts material, the arts and crafts movement, both as it started in England and then as it moved to the U.S. There's a lot of religious and philosophical works, a lot of fine press printing, and a number of literary manuscripts. So a lot of D.H. Lawrence, for example, manuscripts in this collection, as well as the American Southwest is well represented. As an interesting side note, Carl suffered from TB in the 1920s and visited Zion Canyon during his recovery. The interest he developed there in the area is reflected in his book collection, and he became a strong vocal advocate for the creation of Zion National Park. So he actually also has a lot of material that kind of helped him support those arguments for the creation of Zion National Park. There are also extensive collection of manuscripts and documents, including English author D.H. Lawrence, like I mentioned before, a letter from Horatio Nelson, Admiral Nelson, a document signed by Toussaint Louverture, who was probably the most prominent revolutionary leader in the war for Haiti's freedom, and other historical figures represented in the collection, in the manuscript collection, include Louis XVI, John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, Cardinal Richelieu, Abe Lincoln, Hemingway, Twain, Longfellow, Napoleon, and we even have a document signed by Queen Elizabeth I. It's an enormous piece of parchment, and it still actually has the wax seal attached to it. The wax seal is probably about this big around, and maybe that thick. And on one side, she is mounted on her horse, and on the other side, she is seated on the royal throne. And it's just astounding that these things could still be together. So that's what I have by way of the lives of the three men who are responsible largely for the creation of the core of our rare book collection. And so I think if now's a good time, we'll take a break.
Maybe. There you go. This is a good stopping point. So I know, Chris, you had said to me, as we start that second part, if people had questions at that point about the three individuals you've talked about, you can talk about maybe taking questions when we start back. So in about 10 minutes, let's take a break, and then we'll start back. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.